Oklahoma has earned a chilling reputation as America's execution capital. In just the past 2 years, 6 men were put to death, some after decades on death row, others in cases so disturbing they shocked the nation. From a cannibalistic fantasy killer to an inmate transferred from federal custody just to be executed, these stories reveal the darkest side of justice. And each one ended the same way, inside the state's death chamber in McAllister. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Wendell Arden Grissom, Oklahoma, entered 2025 with another execution date on its calendar, and on March 20th, the death chamber in McAllister was readied for Wendell Arden Grissom. His crime dated back nearly 2 decades to 2005, when a late-night home invasion in Watonga turned deadly. That night, Grissom forced his way into the home of 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews and her friend Drew Kopf. Armed and unpredictable, he opened fire. Amber was shot at close range and died instantly. Drew was also shot but managed to survive, later testifying against him in court. Prosecutors described the crime as cold-blooded, a violent act with no justification. The jury agreed. Grissom was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, his case moved through the appeal system, but his death sentence was upheld at every level. By 2025, his legal options had run out. On the morning of his execution, Grissom was brought into the chamber. Witnesses described him as composed, though his final words offered little closure. He gave no sweeping statement, no apology that might soften the memory of what had happened in 2005. At 10:13 a.m., after the lethal injection drugs coursed through his veins, Wendell Grissom was pronounced dead. His execution marked Oklahoma's first of the year, a reminder that the state's death penalty machinery was still very much in motion. For Amber Matthews' family, it brought an end to 20 years of waiting, though no execution can ever erase the pain of such a sudden and senseless loss. But Oklahoma wasn't done. Just a few months later, another inmate was strapped to the gurney. His case dated back to the late 1990s, involving a carjacking, a kidnapping, and the brutal murder of an elderly woman in Tulsa. What made his execution even more unusual was that he had once been in federal custody, but was sent back to Oklahoma for one reason only: to face death. John Fitzgerald Hansen, George Hansen. On June 12, 2025, Oklahoma carried out its second execution of the year. The man strapped to the gurney was John Fitzgerald Hansen, also known in court records as George John Hansen. His crime dated back to the late summer of 1999, and it remains one of Tulsa County's most shocking murder cases. That August, Hansen and his accomplice Victor Miller targeted 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bowles during a carjacking. They forced her into her own vehicle, abducted her, and drove her to a remote location. What followed was brutal. Bowles was murdered, her life cut short in a crime that stunned the Tulsa community. But the violence didn't end there. During the same crime spree, Miller killed a bystander, Gerald Thurman, who had come across the scene. Prosecutors painted Hansen as a calculating criminal who showed no mercy. By 2001, he had been convicted and sentenced to death. But Hansen's case would take an unusual legal path. For years, he was held in federal custody in Louisiana, far from Oklahoma's death row. In 2020, under the Trump administration, federal officials authorized Hansen's transfer back to Oklahoma, specifically so he could face his execution date, a rare move that sparked debate about the coordination between state and federal systems. After decades of appeals, the execution date finally arrived. On June 12th, Hansen was escorted into the chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Witnesses described the procedure as calm but tense, given the long history and controversy tied to his case. The 3-drug lethal injection protocol began at 10:01 a.m., and by 10:11 a.m., Hansen was pronounced dead. For Mary Bowles' family, it marked the end of a 26-year wait for justice. Yet Hansen's unusual journey, from federal prison back to state custody just to be executed, remains one of the more controversial chapters in Oklahoma's recent death penalty history. Michael Duane Smith. On April 4, 2024, Oklahoma carried out its first execution of the year. The man strapped to the gurney was Michael Duane Smith, convicted of a double murder that happened more than 2 decades earlier. Back in February 2002, Oklahoma City was rattled by a wave of shootings. Smith, then only 19 years old, was tied to two of them. The first victim was Janet Moore, a 41-year-old woman who was shot outside her home. Hours later, Sharath Pularu, a 22-year-old convenience store clerk from India, was also killed. Prosecutors said Smith had been on a drug binge, randomly firing at people he believed had wronged him. The evidence painted him as a reckless young man bent on violence, and the jury delivered 2 death sentences. But Smith never accepted that verdict. For over 20 years on death row, he insisted he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. His attorneys fought hard, raising concerns about mental illness, ineffective legal representation, and gaps in the investigation. None of it was enough to stop the state. On the morning of his execution at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Smith was led into the chamber. The witnesses watched as the IV lines were placed. Even then, he held to his story, declaring his innocence one last time. Moments later, the lethal injection drugs began to flow. He was pronounced dead just after 10 a.m. What made Smith's case stand out wasn't just the crime, but his unshakable final words. He went to his grave saying the state had the wrong man. But if Michael Smith's story was about claims of innocence, the next execution tells a very different tale. Imagine a man who spent nearly 40 years on death row, convicted of one of the most disturbing crimes in Oklahoma's history. His last meal raised eyebrows, and his silence in the execution chamber left an eerie echo. That's the case we'll explore next. Richard Norman Rosham Jr. Just 3 months after Michael Smith's execution, Oklahoma prepared for another. On June 27, 2024, the state carried out the death sentence of Richard Norman Rosham Jr., a man whose name had haunted court files for nearly 4 decades. The crime dated back to 1984 in Elk City, Oklahoma. Rosham's stepdaughter, 7-year-old Layla Dawn Cummings, was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered. It was a case so brutal that even seasoned investigators struggled to describe it without emotion. Rosham quickly became the prime suspect, and prosecutors laid out a damning trail of evidence pointing to his involvement. By 1985, he was convicted and sentenced to die. But the execution never came quickly. For nearly 40 years, Rosham lived on death row, making him one of Oklahoma's longest-serving condemned inmates. His case wound its way through appeals, retrials, and resentencings. Each legal turn only delayed the inevitable. When the execution date finally arrived, there was an eerie sense of finality. Witnesses noted that Rosham showed little emotion as he was escorted into the chamber. His last meal request shocked many: a Little Caesars pizza with double cheese and pepperoni, ginger ale, 2 vanilla ice cream cups, and even a stack of salt and red pepper packets. It was oddly ordinary, yet indulgent, as if he were preparing for a casual night in, rather than his final hours on earth. When given the chance to speak, Rosham uttered barely a word. His final statement was chillingly short. I've said my goodbyes." With that, he closed his eyes and the lethal drugs were administered. At 10:16 a.m., he was pronounced dead. For the families of Layla Cummings and those who had waited nearly 40 years, it was a moment of closure, but also a reminder of the long, painful path justice can take. While Rosham's execution stood out for its decades of delay, the next case was controversial for another reason altogether. It involved a man convicted of a robbery turned murder where even the state's own parole board believed he deserved mercy. Yet mercy never came. His execution reignited debates about fairness, justice, and the power of a governor's pen. Kevin Ray Underwood. Of all the executions carried out in Oklahoma in 2024, none stirred more horror than that of Kevin Ray Underwood. His crime was so grotesque that even seasoned investigators admitted it haunted them long after the trial ended. In 2006, Underwood was living in Purcell, Oklahoma. On the surface, he seemed like a quiet, socially awkward man. But inside his apartment, investigators would uncover evidence of a chilling fantasy, one centered on murder and cannibalism. His victim was 10-year-old Jamie Rose Bolin, a neighbor who lived in the same apartment complex. Underwood lured Jamie into his apartment, murdered her, and hid her body in a large plastic storage container. But what investigators found next was even more disturbing. Notes and journals where Underwood detailed plans to sexually assault, mutilate, and consume a victim. He had prepared knives, skewers, and meat tenderizer, all part of his dark fantasy. The crime shocked Oklahoma and the nation, described as one of the most disturbing cases in the state's history. Jurors had little hesitation. In 2008, he was sentenced to death. For more than 15 years, Underwood sat on death row, appeals delaying the inevitable. But in late 2024, his time ran out. On December 19, 2024, he was led into the death chamber at McAlester, the date carrying a haunting irony. It was his 45th birthday. Witnesses said Underwood apologized and expressed remorse before the lethal injection began. Within minutes, the drug silenced the man whose crime had terrified an entire community. The timing of his execution, falling on the very day he was born, added a final eerie twist to a case already drenched in darkness. As Oklahoma moved into 2025, the executions didn't stop. The next man to face the state's death chamber was tied to a home invasion that ended in a young woman's death. His case would mark Oklahoma's first execution of the new year and reopen painful memories for a family that had waited 2 decades for justice. If you found these stories intense, subscribe for more true crime and execution history. Drop a comment below. Do you think Oklahoma's use of the death penalty is justice served, or does it raise more troubling questions? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more haunting stories from Death Row.